Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today on the EIA show, we're going to have a lot to talk about given things that have come out. So we had 2 hurricanes come through. We had Ida, which really impacted part of last week and into this week. And then we had Henri, which came onshore and was obviously hitting a very important spot as it went through Louisiana. And when you look at Port Fortune, you can see that there was this pretty sizable damage, especially for slips that were required for offshore capacity, bringing stuff back online. So when we look back to last week, one of the things that we said is like typically you have offshore production coming back faster than refining. And that still has been the case for the most part. It's just been much slower. And the reason why that's the case is because Port Fortune provides 90% of the offshore deepwater support. So what does that mean? That means that that companies, E&Ps, need to use other slips, other ports to supplement while they repair their region of that port. So now that that has been addressed, they've assessed damage. Damage is being addressed. We're going to see that accelerate. So right now there's about 1.5 million barrels offline. That's down from the peak of about 2 million barrels, 2.2 million barrels, depending on, again, timing. And then as we go down through that, you have to look at the refining side because there were a lot of refiners that were hit that were either damaged and or were waiting for power. So those are things that have come to pass. And if we look at what the EIA says, the EIA is saying that there's about 1.5 million barrels a day offline. If you look at what has been reported, there's still about 2 million barrels a day of refining capacity offline. It's all about when is it reported and what is the throughput, because when you start turning on a refiner, you don't just flip a switch and then start pushing crude through. There's a very segmented process of testing everything out. So these are the different pieces. And then if we look at the Loop or the Louisiana offshore oil platform, that's where we import, export different capacity. Now this was going to impact imports more than exports. So that's going to be another thing that's going to take time. But so far it's been assessed. There's no damage. It's just going to be a matter of when does it have the proper power, go through the protocols, which also should be this week. So we should be on the other side of some of this. And now when you look at the backdrop, we had products that have drawn down. That should continue until we get some capacity. But now, as we get imports coming back, we get production coming back, and refiners still a bit slower, we should have next week, at the end of this week, depending on timing, we should get a build in crude. But again, that's going to be a matter of just kind of averaging things out, just given where we sit. Now, before we go into more detail, we also wanted to talk about, the gasoline drop makes sense, distillate, same thing. But then when we look at the demand side, you saw that big drop in demand across all diesel, jet fuel. Jet fuel not as big as we were expecting. That's something that will most likely come again this week with another drop in demand. And we'll go through TSA data and, more importantly, departures, which are starting to come down along seasonal norms. And then when we turn to gasoline had a small build and a small increase in demand. And one of the things that we've been talking about is when we look at Descartes data, when we look at Gas Buddy data, when we look at Apple and Google mobility data, and finally the DOT or the Department of Transportation, and at the same time also looking at TomTom, you can see that there has been a drop in demand, and it's not just from Ida and from Henri, which obviously did impact demand in terms of people actually going out and driving, but you're also going to prepare. So you're going to rush out and you're going to fill your tank, and then that's going to have to be backfilled. So you had a lot of backfill happenings, but then the actual underlying driving And looking at Descartes, they've had declines for the last 6 weeks. They follow cell phone data. You look at Gas Buddy, something very similar. We've seen a steady decline in driving, but yet the implied demand is still up. And that's because when you look at the EIA is looking of when it leaves the tanks there to go to blending and then on a truck to the end user. So when we look at the end user side, we see demand falling, but there's still that backlog of, well, some places, filled up quickly. So that's gonna be one where we thought there was gonna be a little bit of a drop. Instead, there was a small increase. But as we get to the other side of some of these supply chain bottlenecks, these hurricane-driven issues, you're going to start to see that come down just to marry with where things are on the demand side. Because on the, let's just say the pump is in the middle, on the right side of the pump, which is the, looking at the consumer, that has been falling, but just getting the gasoline to that pump has had those bottlenecks, which is showing that increase. So this is going to be something that's going to take some time to work itself out. And then the other things had those reversals that we were expecting, including diesel and some of these others. But we'll go through that in more detail. I just wanted to provide a little bit of that backdrop and that summary, if you will. Now, if we go abroad, you have China, which announced releasing about 22 million barrels from their SPR. And this is going to be an interesting backdrop because when you look at what China is doing, they're trying to manage pricing internally. And to be clear, not to tout, but to tout, I guess, we've been spot on with China since we launched the Econ show, and we did another China show yesterday looking at local consumer. What does it mean? How is that driving energy demand and just demand in general? And these are things that we're going to follow on in segment 3. So now when we turn to the refining outages, this is what we're looking at with what's been reported. You can see just over 2 million barrels a day of refining throughput. But again, this is looking at the distillation units. So it could be other processes are back, which is making up some of this. So again, it's just... It's all an estimate, and it's when is it reported, how is it reported, what is down. So again, there's going to be which is why we like to use the 4-week rolling average to try to smooth out some of this, to really look at where are the trends going, where are things moving, and we'll continue to talk about that. So I would say we're probably much closer to about 1.5 to 1.7 million barrels a day offline. And then by the time we get to the end of the week, we should see, based on the fact that a lot of these facilities have now gotten power back and are in the process of turning on boilers and testing machinery, moving product through the system. So that should bring things back. And then we should see it based on what BP has said. There's going to be there should be able to bring back the additional 2 platforms by the end of the week. Others are in the same point, but there has been some sustained damage in some of the offshore areas. So we should see not 100% come back, but at least 90 to 95% of it by realistically the timing wise by the middle of next week. But again, there could be some of things pushed as people show up and find out that, hey, this is a bit more damage than we saw from the sky or what we saw with drones. It's going to, instead of it being back in the next 5 days, it's going to be 15 days, something like that. So these are things that we're going to have to look at. But realistically, by the time we get to Wednesday of next week, we should see about 90% return to the market from the production side. But we'll continue to provide that data as we go forward. So now when we look at some of the near-term issues, the Typhoon here, especially in Asia, we have one going left, which is going to impact Vietnam. Again, that's not going to be as strong as the one that is currently expected to make a near direct hit on Taiwan. So before this was supposed to go over Taiwan and directly into China, it is now veered to the right. So this is going to be one to watch because it is accelerated quickly. It's now at about it was at a 4. It then went to a 5. It's going back and forth between a 4 and a 5, depending on sustained winds. So it's gonna pack a punch. There's gonna be a lot to talk about when we get to the other side, especially given Taiwan and some of these other areas within China, which are key ports, especially as it goes north. It's just going to be a matter of, does it veer to the left or does it continue to veer to the right, and these are going to impact. But in general, you're going to see some of these issues as we go forward. Now, when we look at the U.S., you have Olaf, which is accelerated, and it was going to hit a piece of Mexico. And then when we look at Mindy, right now it's right off the coast of Georgia. That is one that is going to go through and essentially cut straight through Georgia, Florida. Maybe hit a piece of South Carolina and then continue on. There's just based on strengths, there shouldn't be too much of an issue in terms of damages, but it will impact demand more than anything else. It's also missing a lot of capacity when you're considering refining, gas and oil and gas production. So there should be minimal outside of just people staying indoors, avoiding driving. So again, that's going to be a bit more of an impact to demand versus anything else. So the other component when we start looking at inventories, because we did lose that capacity coming off of the Gulf of Mexico, we have to find that. We have to go and source that. So as we have new capacity coming back online, the U.S. has gone out and bought a significant, or I should say not a significant, but an increased amount of Urals and an increased amount of Nigerian barrels. So right now we had 6 at the end of last week added. So we have 22 vessels coming into the U.S. that should increase over the next, let's call it 6 days, depending on when these capacity comes back online. It makes sense just given that you have Urals that are still trading at a discount, Nigeria, which is struggling to sell, so you can get a decent price off of that, ESPO, which is increasing throughput. So that's going to be opportunity for the U.S. to go out and source new barrels. And then as they show up, will they get resold? Or when you think about them being imported and production turning back on, we could actually get this one quick surge or this wave of crude coming in. And we're going to compare a lot of this to Harvey because there's a lot of similarities in terms of, especially on the gasoline side, where those Harvey impacts were. So when we look at inventories, you can see here that we're tracking still right along 2019, dipped just below 2015, and when you look at 2017, there was actually that increase. But when you look at the differences of where it hit, the Louisiana one impacted production and imports way more than Harvey, and Harvey impacted a lot more refining versus production. So when you look at the differences, there was almost an equal decline between production and refining, where when you look at Harvey, there was a much bigger impact to refining versus the production side. So that resulted in those increases. But as we go forward, those are going to be things to talk about and look at, with the U.S. releasing about 1.5 million barrels from the SPR, which should show up in the data next week or the week after. So it depends on when that happens. So then when we look at days of supply, you can see that we're still right around the same level as last week. We haven't had too much movement, but when you look at 2017, this is where you had that drop in refining, that increase in crude, and that's where you get this big increase in days of supply. So now when we look at oil storage and products, we had about a 7.2 million barrel drop in gasoline. We had a 3.14 million drop in distillate, and then obviously the 1.5 million in crude. So that helped draw down some of this product and just below now 2019. Now this is something that will see some reversal, but more driven by crude and less on products, because we should see product draws continue over the next week to 2 weeks, depending on timing of imports, as well as obviously refiners coming back online. So then when we look at gasoline storage, you can see it almost mirrors the drop in 2017 from Harvey. And then you can see that right after Harvey, you had another drop down and before you started to see those increases. And that's based on what we've seen, what we know on hurricanes. Again, hurricane trading 101. And this is some of we should see one more drop of gasoline demand, gasoline storage, before we start to see some of that rebuild. And that's just because right now ARBs blow open. That's going to bring in more product, as well as incentivize refiners to increase some of their gasoline runs. Distillate is now right at the 29-year average, but you can see that we're still in a very interesting spot when you think about where distillate storage is, and just given what the expectations are for winter, because we still do use heating oil. Heating oil is more diesel now than anything else. But again, if we have a cold winter, if we do start to see that come through, it's not only going to be bullish, obviously, for natural gas, but also propane and also heating oil. And we're going to talk about propane again in more detail, because it continues to be a very bullish side, which is as we keep talking about on the NGL basket. So jet fuel had a nice drop. That's something that is more about where is it going to be stored? Is it going to be jet, kerosene? Are we going to see that get pushed into the disty cut? But again, we're back down to about that 29-year average. Now, when we look at the crude curve, you see the crude curve had some support. When we look at through 65, essentially till about August of 22. When you look above 60, we essentially go through 2023. So again, there's still support for production. There's still support for activity. This is something to watch, as we talked about with the OPEC deal. With some of those increases that we saw coming through October, we're going to talk about more on what are some of the flows and what does that mean for new crude hitting the water in segment 3. Then providing a quick update on COVID. COVID increase maintains a steady flow in the U.S. We did see some drop downs. Some of that, there's a decent data dump at the end by Friday. So Friday is going to be a better gauge on how, where's the U.S. right now. But again, there's not too much happening. Europe had a little bit of an increase. The U.K. has been steady where she is. India's had a slight increase, but again, it's in pockets. So on a net level, there's pretty much no change, but there are pockets of increases, which is causing some concern. But again, nothing meaningful in terms of impacting crude demand on different levels, but we'll talk about that more again in segment 3. And then when we look at Asia Pacific, you can see things remaining fairly elevated across South Korea, Vietnam. Japan is coming down a bit, but again, just going to be watched to see if there's a little increase as things continue to evolve. For the most part, there shouldn't be too much of a change. The question is going to be what happens as we get through September. And we're going to look at some of those trends that we saw in 2020, especially in the U.S. and in Europe, when we start talking about product demand and what do we expect as we go through the fall season. Now getting more granular on the stock draws. So here you can see a drop of 1.5 million barrels, 1.53 million barrels. That's now 40 million below the 5-year average. We did get a small build in pad 1 and pad 2. Cushing was up 1.92 million. That's now only 11.5 million below the 5-year average. This was a much bigger build in Cushing than we were expecting. We thought it was going to be a bit more of a gradual move, but at the same time, you also had crude not moving down to the coast. So again, that's where you got some of that pushback that created a bigger increase, which is why when you look over the next 4 weeks, could we see a draw in Cushing? Absolutely, as some of these assets come back online. This is going to be one to watch, but on a net level, when we span this out over 4 weeks, we think that we're going to see that pretty steady increase of builds. And then when you look at pad 3 had a draw of 2.59 million. That's now 8.8 million below the 5-year average. And then the SPR didn't show any change. That's something that takes time. It's about 14 to 18 to 20 days from when the president announces it, goes through Congress, gets released. So again, that's going to be something to watch. And when you look at production, the EIA has production down 1.5 million barrels. That's probably where we are right now. It could be closer to 1.4 at this point, but again, we're going to have to look at that as it comes through. And then the imports of Russian oil, Urals to the U.S. are set to increase in September and October, as 77% of that Gulf of Mexico remains shut. When you look at the amount so far, right now we've lost about 21.5 million barrels of production, net in terms of if you add every day together. we should see more of that impact as we go through, which is why you're seeing these purchases in September to refill now, and then as we go out into October, which has helped bid up some of that Russian barrel, some of that Russian euro barrels. But at the same time, there's protests within Libya that is putting at risk about 3 ports, which could impact about 800,000 barrels a day of exports. So that's kind of that other side of, the Euros have the U.S. increasing purchasing, and at the same time, the loss of Libya into some of the Mediterranean is also going to be supportive. But those are going to be things that we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the segment. So then when we look at land storage had a drop last week. We saw a net drop of 11.6 million barrels. That has since reversed a bit. You had a build in Europe. You had a small draw in the U.S., but the build in Europe offset the U.S., and we did have some more builds in the east of Suez. So we should see this, again, still below the 5-year average, but back within the bottom of that cloud. And it's all about timing, because even though we have a drop in land storage, we did have an increase in underlying offshore storage. So when you look at the increase, east of Suez had an increase last week, had an increase this week, so we should see that continue. West of Suez, another increase, and then floating storage on a net level, we did get an increase. So even though, and this is what we keep talking about with these timing delays, we're still well above the 5-year average, especially when you look at Asia or east of Suez. That's actually getting worse, not better. Some of that might change depending on where the Typhoon goes, how many cargoes have to move to avoid impact. So we should see things adjust and then come back. So there could be a little bit of a bump, but again, it's more semantics. It's more about just how is it calculated. So those are things that we will continue to look at. Now, when we turn to, TomTom data, here you can see the Americas had a drop. You can see just how deep that drop went. And again, that's just people not driving because you had Ida coming through. At the same time, you had Henri coming onshore. So this had a much bigger impact. When you look at the Americas in general, you see that decline. A lot of that will reverse back to where it was. Europe has had a nice rally, but when you look at last year, you can see that September was very strong and then peaked at the end of September to come back down for October. And that's going to be something to watch. There was obviously the renewed outbreak. How much of that is going to be a renewed outbreak? How much of it is just going to be a little bit of seasonality? So that's going to be one. China is right at about that 95% of normal, as we see the rest of Asia continuing to kind of wake up as some of these COVID cases come down. But at the same time, people are just like, look, COVID's here. We have to get on with our lives, and you're starting to see some of that come through on the Asian side as cases do fall, but you're starting to see people get antsy and move around again. So net, we are seeing some of that increase, which is a positive in general. So then when we look at Pad 3, here's where you can see the white line is 2017. You can see the spike in Harvey due to Harvey as it was coming down this line. We do expect to see some of that increase. It's just going to be a matter of timing to see when does that happen. Based on where things are shaping up, it should be this week into next week, but it'll just be a matter of when does that show up in general. Then when we look at Cushing, here you can see that you get that average coming back up to that average. We think that there's going to be over the next 4 weeks, if you look past the last 2 weeks and forward the next 2 weeks, they're going to average out to a fairly steady build. We think that's going to continue over the next few weeks as we start to see some of that normalize a bit, given it's coming from a nice low level. But again, these are things to manage as we go forward. So then when we look at imports were down 531,000 barrels. That's a drop from 6.34 million to 5.8 million. You can see that it was created, obviously, 247,000 barrels a day was lost out of Pad 3. But also Pad 5. Pad 5 had a big drop of 325,000 barrels a day. That's, as we've been talking about, that's just timing. When does it come back? When does it see some of that snapback? European imports of clean petroleum product from East Asia are set to hit their highest since May. That's still the case. We're going to talk about some of those shifts in general. And then when we look at weekly imports of gasoline from Europe, Those continue to rise. We should see another increase as we go through September. That's going to be supported based on just where spreads are and some of the increases that we've seen within Europe as, again, they're trying to manage storage. So imports are going to adjust. We will see oil imports increase as they make up for what was lost due to timing, due to power. And then we will see additional products also fill some of that void, both into Pad 5 and into Pad 1. So then when we look at runs, here you can see that there was a drop of about 9.4%, comes down to about 1.6 million barrels a day lost. That marries closely to what we were seeing right now, about 1.7. So again, here's where you can kind of get that drop. But when you look at Pad 3, it accounted for 1.57 million barrels a day of loss, 233,000 barrels a day in Pad 2. Some of that will come back, again, just depending based on timing. We're already coming into where you have product refiners come down. So we're really not going to get back to that 90%. We'll likely start to peter out closer to 87, 89% maybe. But I would say much closer to 87, 88 as we go through a large part of the shoulder season. So then when we look at implied demand, this is what we were talking about with the increase in gasoline. You had an increase of about 30,000 barrels up to 9.608 million. That's something that we were expecting to come closer to about 9.2, 9.3. Instead, we got that one more increase. That is where now we think that you do get that drop. When you look at some of the impacts, I think I was really underestimating Henri and what that was going to do for pulling some of that through, as well as that remainder of Ida. So you had Ida still there, then you have the second hurricane. So that helped provide some of that support for gasoline. But then when you look at distillate had a drop. Again, that will reverse. When you look at this, it's typically one week up, 1 week down. It's just a matter of where are the highs and where are the lows. And we do think that you're going to get a little bit of lower highs, but not really lower lows. We think that the floor is really there, just given the supply chain issues and the amount of demand for trucking. Jet fuel dropped 175,000 barrels a day. That was something that we thought was going to be a bit larger. So we do think there will be some follow through in that. And then propane had a drop of 455,000 barrels a day. And a lot of that is also driven based on the loss of petchem. So you did have petrochemical that was also impacted, and that reduced the amount of demand when we're looking at what was expected for refiners, what was expected for export, what was expected for local consumption, i.e. petchem. So then when we look at what could come over from Europe, so right now they're expected to rise. They're expected to be at about 1.2 million tons aboard about 29 tankers. Includes 5 tankers that have sailed. So right now there's about 21 that are loaded. That are set to be loaded, and that compares to about 22 tankers in August. So again, you're seeing that still we have that steady flow, which will show up in Pad 1. So then when we look at floating storage only increased modestly. That's something where, again, moving back into position, you have that 7-day number. So this is one where we do think you will get that spike back up as they get recognized, and we do have more of that flow coming through. And when you start looking at Nigeria and what is slated to come into the U.S. So then when we look at import data into Pad 3, you can see seasonally adjusted new low. That's something that we'll see the reverse. It's just a matter of timing and come closer to the highs that we saw over the last 3 weeks. Still below the 5-year average, but again, you're going to have some of that makeup in general that will show up. Pad 2 had a small decline in imports. Again, still seasonally adjusted high. We still think it stays above that 5-year average. When you think about over the next 4 weeks, there's still a lot of demand coming in when you look at imports into Pad 2. So then when we look at refinery drops here, you can see just how big that drop was. We will see some of that come back. It'll be over the next 2 weeks. But as we talked about, if you remember when I was at Bloomberg, one of the things that we were talking about during Harvey, you just weren't going to go back to where you came from just because you're coming into a soft period when you think about seasonality. So again, you're not going to see all of it come back, but you will see some of it. So those are going to be things that will follow follow over the next few weeks. And now in the next segment, we're going to go much deeper into product demand. What was impacted by the hurricane? How much of it is going to be supported through the fall, and then really into the end of the year.